if you look across the list, this is meta-analyses from for a bunch of different terms, neurosynth, and you can see everything from maintenance to pain to interference to attention to conflict. Lots of different things cause maybe different parts of the anterior cingulate, but certainly overlapping parts of the anterior cingulate to be engaged. And so that suggests that the strategies that we've been using for neuroimaging are problematic in trying to really understand the function of a particular brain area. And I'll come back to this. With regard to psychiatric disorders, you see very similar sort of lack of specificity. So this is one particular study from Emma Spruton and colleagues a few years ago, where they did a meta-analysis across a bunch of different studies of different psychiatric disorders and found basically that, you could see differences between sick people and healthy people, but there was no significant effect of diagnosis on the spatial distribution of those differences. So basically, you can't tell if it's a study of schizophrenia or depression just by looking at where the differences are. So we might ask, how did we end up with such a lack of specificity? And the answer that I want to give is we've been asking the wrong type of question. And so I want to kind of get at this using a thought experiment. Let's say, what if the phrenologist had fMRI? Now, I think we mostly, the phrenologist had a view of the structure of the mind based on faculty psychology, which the mind is made up of these things like amativeness and conjugal love and self-esteem and suavity and so on, that are each associated with a particular part of the brain, and that part of the brain, when it is a strong faculty, pushes out, causes a bump on the skull. Now we know that last part of the story is just demonstrably wrong. We also think that that there are particular kind of the organs of the mind that they looked at. We don't think those are fundamental aspects of mental function, right? But nonetheless, if the phrenologists had gotten their hands on fMRI, they could have done experiments, right? So let's say that you're a phrenologist who's interested in suavity, and you want to go do an experiment to understand the neural basis of suavity. Well, you could do an experiment where you show people pictures of suave individuals and pictures of not so suave individuals, and then look at differences in brain activity. And none of us would probably doubt that they would find something, right, and write a paper saying, the neural basis of suavity, right? So the point is that, the fact that something can be found with imaging doesn't necessarily tell us that particular cognitive ontology that's underlying the experiment is really kind of cutting the mind at its joints. I kind of an extension of this particular thought experiment a few years ago, where I went through and said, for all of Gall's faculties, if I was a phrenologist, could I find a paper that I would claim would evidence of the neurolocalization of that particular faculty? And for basically almost all of them, I could. Wasn't that hard. I'm sure it'd be even easier now. You might further imagine that, young Franz Yarkoni or someone like that could come along and build a tool to actually do meta-analyses across the phrenological fMRI literature, like phrenosynth, right? And then we could do automated meta-analyses of suavity and all of the other faculties. And you can imagine what the literature would look like when you did that, right? You would get something that looks very much like what we get with today's literature, where you get activation of lots of different faculties, and they would all overlap with one another. In fact, that's just the map that we saw earlier from neurosynth. So the strategy that we've been using for understanding, for mapping mind to brain, is sort of fundamentally unable to give us the kind of answers that we want. And I call this the neural correlates strategy, which I want to argue is sort of an unselective kind of it. So let's say that you're a researcher who's interested in social cognition, and you go do a study and you find a map. This is actually the social cognition meta-analysis from neurosynth. And let's say that some other researcher comes along and they're autobiographical memory, right? And they do a study, and hey, they find a map that looks almost exactly the same as the one for autobiographical, or sorry, for social cognition. Somebody else comes along and they're interested in value-based decision making, and they do a map that kind of overlaps a little bit with that map with the maps of memory and social cognition. Now the question is, you see a new map, what can you infer about what's going on in the mind of this individual? And many of you may have already guessed, this is actually the map of the default mode. This is the meta-analytic default mode. So basically, this is the map of somebody just engaging in self-directed thought. And so one way to frame what's being done here is what I like to call sort of following Newell's famous 1973 paper, the 20 question strategy, right? So he was talking about early cognitive psychology, but I think his point remains here, that playing 20 questions with nature is a bad strategy to try to understand how a system works. Instead, you really need theories that sort of describe what's going on in the system and allow you to then make predictions from that. So Tal Yarkoni and I wrote a paper a few years ago that basically made the argument that we need to take a strategy that allows us to move from this very unselective type of inference to a selective inference strategy that basically asks, what can we decode from brain activity that's specific to particular mental states? And that will allow us to start more selectively relating activity patterns in the brain to particular cognitive functions. Now, we started doing this, a long time ago. This is our first paper from 2009, where this is with Steve Hansen and Yara Kalchenko, where we looked at people doing a bunch of different tasks, and we basically said, can we decode what task an individual is doing based on what particular types of basically based on a classifier trained on other people's brain activity, and then we ask further, can we kind of decompose what's going on there by saying, we think that these different tasks are related to different cognitive functions, but we didn't really come up with a very deep kind of decomposition of what was actually going on in those tasks, and ultimately it's not really the task to decode, right? It's the processes or states or functions that underlie the task, right? Tasks are the tools that psychologists use to try to manipulate mental functions, but it's the mental functions that we really care about, not the tasks. And one challenge is we don't even really know what those mental functions are in a formal way. And so that's the argument I want to make next. And I want to make that again with a thought experiment. Let's say you're a chemist, right? And there are questions you might hope chemists could answer, like what are all the enzymes? If you're a chemist and you want to answer that question, it turns out there's a set of books called The Enzymes that tell you what all the enzymes are. And further, you can go to things like the gene ontology that tell you where those enzymes sit in relation to particular metabolic processes in the cell. You might hope that we would have some place to find kind of parallel sort of ontology of underlying psychological functions in cognitive psychology and neuroscience. But if you look at cognitive psychology books, they actually don't do a very good job of kind of telling the structure of, right? They tell you the very high level structure, right? Language, memory, and things like that that we've known about that are basically part of folk psychology. But they don't lay out in detail what's the structure of all the different parts of the mind. Now, interestingly, some of you who've been in imaging for a long time will remember these types of diagrams that one used to see in the previous century, particularly out of PET studies, where people were doing different types of task comparisons, task contrast, to try to isolate a particular cognitive function. So this is from Kathy Price's conjunction analysis paper, where she said, we can take 4 different tasks that vary in a lot of different ways. The only thing that's common between them, we think, in terms of the psychological functions that are being isolated, is phonology. And that, in this case, would let you find the conjunction across those tasks that would just isolate phonology. So we developed a project a while ago called the Cognitive Atlas that basically is aimed to provide the kind of ontology that you get from, in other fields, like from the gene ontology. We want to provide a similar sort of formal knowledge base about cognitive functions and their relation to cognitive tasks for the field of cognitive science and cognitive. So this is the kind of knowledge that's contained in the Cognitive Atlas. We describe sort of what we call mental concepts, which are things that are in the head that we can't see, but that we think tasks measure, things like executive function or working memory updating. And then we describe the mental tasks that measure them, right? And in particular, we say, there are particular tasks, and, in general, in order to measure something with a task, you need a contrast between conditions. So we establish relationships, formal relationships between particular contrasts on a task and the particular concepts that we think they measure. And one of the things that we try to be very careful to do is avoid describing tasks in terms of mental concepts. So for example, people will often use terms like a working memory task, right? But they would say the in-back working memory task, but that's a theory about what that task involves, right? The task is, we would call it just an in-back task because no individual task solely measures a single cognitive function in general. And so we try to be careful to kind of distinguish those. So what we ultimately want to do then is be able to use this map of mental concepts to tell us what we can decode from lots of different tasks. But to do that, we need data across many different tasks so we can isolate particular cognitive functions from those tasks. So what I want to do now is turn to talking about a set of analyses that we've done that have looked at basically our ability to decode not cognitive tasks, but actually decode cognitive functions and take advantage of ontological information in the context of decoding. So the first study I'm going to tell you about is one that we published last year, and really led by and Yannick Schwartz, who was a student in his lab, that was focused on coding of relatively kind of simple cognitive and task features, but using a cognitive ontology. So the idea is, we have a bunch of different tasks, and they have different features, like they present faces or they have a right hand motor response. But we also know that there's hierarchical information about the relationships between those two things, right? So for example, we know that both left hand and right hand responses are types of hand response. Both faces and places and objects and scrambled objects are all types of visual object recognition processes. So what we want to be able to do ultimately is either do reverse inference, where if we have an image, we want to be able to infer what cognitive functions are being engaged in that image, in the task that gave rise to that image. And also then, we want to be able to do forward inference such that if we have a particular task that we know engages, uses right-hand motor responses and visual object recognition with places, we can predict what the activation map should look like. So this is what the ontology looks like for the study that we did, and you can see it's relatively kind of task driven. It's not really getting at kind of deep cognitive functions, except in a few cases like language or calculation. For the most part, it's like details. It's categories that come more from an ontology, this cogpo ontology, which was really meant to describe features of a task, like does it involve human voices, or does it involve vertical checkerboards, and so on. And so we annotate each of the 30 task contrasts using these different ontological features, and then use a setup Gael and Yannick developed that they call stacked decoders, where the idea is basically for every one of the different features in the ontology, you develop a set of basically either one versus one or one versus all classifiers, and you basically try to learn each of those, and then you basically for any new image, you basically put together the predictions for all of those different classifiers into sort of a common space, and then you can basically make predictions about each of the different features, so that now if we have an image, we can basically say which of the particular ontological features do we think is giving rise to that image. And when we do that, one of the things that we see is the resulting support in the brain turns out to be much cleaner and clearer than what we see with other approaches. So we could just like B here is just like a standard contrast-based analysis for the data. And there you see that there's a lot of it between the different types of task features. We can also build a classifier in the way that people usually would, using kind of, in this case, logistic regression to do reverse inference on those different task features, the different logical features. And there you see that you get a much cleaner map, but still fairly kind of piecemeal. And it becomes even cleaner when you in column D here, when you use the ontological decoder. And just for comparison, we also show what you get out of Neurosynth, and it turns out that those maps are substantially, they overlap a bit, but they're substantially noisier. And Neurosynth also doesn't cover all of the concepts that we might want. So ask now, given an image, so I think we did leave 3 out here, So basically the idea is, given a particular data set, can you train on a subset of the data sets and then predict the presence or absence of a particular cognitive function using the classifier, using the decoder. And it turns out that, in some cases we don't do that well, but in many cases you can do quite well. And in general, this ontological decoder does either slightly to substantially better than either a standard kind of, logistic regression reverse inference tool, naive Bayes, or for the terms that are in neuroscience, generally we also do better than that as well. And you can see over on the right here the kind of overall, relative and you see that the ontology decoder does substantially better. So this suggests that this ontology decoding does seem to, using the ontological knowledge about the relationships between tasks, appears to improve performance. But again, these are concepts that are fairly limited and not really, and they're very tied to the kind of the surface details of the task rather than the underlying cognitive function. So the next question that we've asked is, can we move towards richer cognitive features? And obviously this requires a data set with lots of sort of rich cognitive task conditions. And so the data set that we've been working on is one that was originally collected by Maeve King, Jørn Diedrichsen, and Rich Ivory. And the first paper on this that was focused on cerebellum came out in Nature Neuroscience earlier this year. And so this involved 24 subjects, each of whom performed 26 tasks that comprise 47 unique task conditions. So we have a lot of contrast we can build, out of each of those conditions, and a lot of data per individual. So each subject completed about 5.5 hours of fMRI data acquisition. So these are maps of some of the different tasks. These are cerebellar flat maps from the Nature Neuroscience paper, just to kind of give you a feel for what the different tasks are. Jørn and Rich are very focused on cerebellum. I'm going to tell you about analyses that focus on the cerebral cortex, though I'll mention that actually the results of all the decoding analyses don't really differ if you also look at this. I want to focus particularly on the idea of building a cognitive encoding model. So in the visual neuroscience world, there's been a lot of progress in sort of, pushed particularly by Jack Gallant's group and also used by a number of other groups in building what we call encoding models that basically try to say, for any particular stimulus that's presented or task that's presented, what are the features that are present in that stimulus? And those could be surface features or they could be model-driven features. And then, how does that relate to, can you use that to model brain activity at a particular voxel or region of the brain? And then, from that, predict the activity, predict the pattern of activity for any new stimulus that hasn't been seen before. And this has been done nicely, for example, in in cases of looking at images or natural videos. So we wanted to take that idea and extend it out into the modeling of cognitive processes. So the idea is that we from individuals performing a set of tasks, we get a contrast for each subject on each of those different contrasts from all the 47 contrasts across all the different tasks. And we're going to, in everything I'm going to be showing, we're using parcellated data. So we average the Z statistics within each of the 1,000 parcels within the Schaefer atlas from Thomas Yo's group. And this is primarily for kind of computational reasons. It just makes things faster. And I think that we've looked across parcellations and it doesn't seem to, the answers don't seem to differ that much depending on as long as you're above a few hundred parcels, the answers are pretty similar. So the idea is we take all the Z stats from each parcel, we average those for each contrast, and then we build a design where, so in this case, you're looking at the design matrix for the encoding model. So each row is one of those 47 contrasts, and then each column is basically our annotation of these different tasks. So for example, we might say that one of the tasks involves, some number of the tasks involve autobiographical recall, some of them involve thinking, some of them involve emotion recognition, some of them involve imagination, some of them involve action observation. These are, just to point out, these are all manually annotated, right? So they're our decisions about these tasks. Somebody else could annotate this in a very different way and come up with a different annotation. And that's one of the challenges that I think we can come back and talk about. The idea is that we then model activity within each of the parcels across all those tasks and estimate a weighting for each of the ontology elements. Okay, so we have here, I forget how many, 40 or so ontology elements across the 47 contrasts. And here's just a close look at the design matrix where we've normed by each feature, right? So there's a few features that basically only occur for one task, right? I think there's them here that are basically only present for one task, a few that are present for two tasks, and then some that are present that are really sort of, that vary a lot across all the tasks. And some of them were generated as actually continuous values. So for example, measuring the number of saccades across tasks and actually quantifying that in a more continuous way. So if we just do PCA across the design matrix, that there's probably to describe it, well overall, you probably need about 20 principal components. And I'm not going to show you the data from the principal component regression analyses we did, but we see that basically with about 20, if you put in the first 20 principal components of the design matrix, the results basically kind of stabilize at that point. So what we want to do then is basically, ultimately, we want to be able to predict activation for a new task, right? So we want to basically be able to train a model that says, here's, our estimates of each region's response to all those different cognitive functions, leaving out some number of tasks. And in this case, we're going to leave out two tasks. And this is the trick that Tom Mitchell first developed in his early paper on language decoding. So the idea is we train the model, leaving out two tasks, and then we basically invert the model to predict the activation map for each of those two left out tasks. So the idea is we get two predicted images. And then the question is, how do we assess our success? And the way that we've done it, which I think is, obviously there's many ways to do this. The way that we've chosen, I think is nice because it's interpretable in terms of the metric that you get, which is basically how successful are you at matching the predicted images, the actual images for those tasks, right? So for each one of those left out tests, we have the actual image for each subject. And so we basically say if our predicted image for task one is closer to the actual image for task one than task two, and that's where close means higher Pearson correlation. And likewise, if the predicted image for task two is closer to the actual image for task two than task one, then we basically say that we are successful if we get both of those right. And it turns out we can do quite well, even just using linear regression. We get out of sample classification accuracy of about 0.5, and this is the right panel here, and the gray part of the gray distribution at the bottom is the distribution that we get if we row shuffle the design. So basically breaking the relationship between tasks and brain systems. And so you actually see that we do substantially better if we use ridge regression, and that's presumably due to the substantial correlations in that design matrix. And so this shows that we can actually do surprisingly well at predicting activation maps basically out of using using activation maps from other tasks. And the distribution here that you're seeing are distributions across individuals, across the 24 individuals. So what we can then do is ask, what is the confusion matrix like? And in this case, looking at the correlations, the representational dissimilarity matrix of the task confusion matrix. So basically saying which tasks are different from which other tasks, and sort of, I guess comfortingly, you see that a lot of the structure here has to do with basically different conditions on the same task being classified together. So for example, if you look at the very bottom here, all the visual search tasks are highly confusable. All the mental rotation tasks are highly confusable. And then you see that a number of different relationships exist that you would also expect, like, video, landscape, movies, different types of faces together, different types of scenes together. So there's a comforting amount of kind of similarity in that confusion matrix. Now, what we can also do is then project that into the cognitive space, knowing what we know about the relationships between those tasks and the cognitive functions. And there you see that there's a substantial there's a few things that seem sort of reasonable, but there's also a substantial amount of kind of confusability that one might not expect. So for example, the things that are sort of reasonable are like, here in the middle, you see that updating, visual working memory, active maintenance, interference resolution, cognitive load, things that you would expect to kind of, move together in terms of their underlying brain patterns do so. Similarly, motor control, response selection, and action move together. Visual perception, language processing, motor planning are things that you may not have expected to go together. And quote unquote working memory is kind of separate from these other things that we think, probably are more likely to involve working memory. And so there's, this is suggesting one that, well, we're certainly capturing something. The fact that we can make these predictions says that we're capturing something. But on the other hand, there's still, in terms of whether this ontology is the right one, this suggests that there's probably, that we could probably do better in terms of mapping those tasks into cognitive functions, because you would like to see them really clustering together much more cleanly as the tasks do. We can also ask, how do these relate to large-scale networks? When you look across the different large-scale networks in terms of their overall mapping onto cognitive functions, do they make sense, right? So some of them certainly do. The visual network, you get lots of stuff related to vision. The parietal control network, you get things related to task switching and updated load and maintenance. Dorsal attention network, you get a little bit messier. You get attention, you get action observation, you also get motor planning. But then, in some other ones like this limbic network, you're kind of, you're getting a bunch of stuff that you really would have expected more to be associated with sort of, higher level control networks. And we can also dig in and kind of look at the maps for one of the particular networks and see this is for the control network. For the three highest loading systems, you get maps that kind of look somewhat reasonable in parts, though, other parts are maybe not exactly what you would expect. And in particular, kind of negative loading, task switching in the visual networks. So we've also asked, whether we can generalize across subjects. And so what we do here, this is basically taking the learned for each individual and generalizing it to looking at how well it generalizes to all the other individuals. So each bar here, basically generalizing from one subject's model to all the other subjects. And you see that we don't do as well as we did, from within subject, but we do reasonably well, certainly a lot better than I would have expected. So average is around 0.8 accuracy. Now, another question you might ask is like, how well do you do if you just classify by task, right? So you basically say, instead of trying to say, we want to classify these ontology elements, we build a model instead that basically just says, I want to see how well can I predict the model just using the average activation pattern for that model, for that particular task for other subjects, right? And this is obviously limited because you can't predict for new tasks. But the question is, do you do a lot better when you're just predicting based on tasks than when you're predicting based on the ontology? And the answer is you do a tiny bit better, but actually you're almost as good, pretty much, as good when you use the ontology, the learned ontology mapping to let you predict to new tasks as opposed to just predicting within the same task. So it suggests is that, even though this ontology clearly has a ways to go in terms of like its understandability and its, the sort of confusability, it's clearly capturing enough to do a pretty good job of actually predicting out of subjects. So really the place that I see this going is really allowing us to start testing between different ontologies. So and we haven't done this yet, but I think it's, this is one of the next steps for us is, let's say that, you have 4 different tasks and there's 2 different sort of theories about how those tasks work. And you can think of cognitive theories as really kind of implementing a cognitive ontology in many cases. So let's say, one group says that we have a model that says that, these 2 tasks involve something called inhibition, and these other 2 tasks involve something called updating. and somebody else has a model that says, no, those all rely on the same cognitive function X, right? And obviously, you'd want your version of this to actually do this kind of testing. But the point is, once you have two different ontologies, now you can ask which of those models provides a better prediction of brain activity. So this allows us to go from, with something that's been, it allows us to do something that's always been a bit of a holy grail, which is to ask, answer questions about cognitive theories using brain imaging data. So kind of step back a little bit and ask about the nature of the ontologies that we're using. So, ontologies in cognitive science and in cognitive science have almost always been expressed in terms of natural language, right? So we talk about things like quote unquote working memory, quote unquote episodic buffer, so on, right? And if you look at the cognitive atlas, it's all written in terms of the names of cognitive functions that we think we can understand. But within, sorry, one might argue that this is necessarily a fundamentally limited way to understand what the brain is doing, and you can get some kind of inspiration from that, both from work ideas that have been around for a long time from physics. Like Eugene Wigner wrote this famous paper, The Unreasonable Effectiveness of Mathematics in the Natural Sciences. And more generally, in science, progress has often involved a transition from natural language to some other form of expression. In this case, in physics, it's moving from natural language to mathematics. In biology, it's moving from mathematics to other types of languages. So take our understanding of brain cancer, right? So prior to 1900, we talked about quote unquote brain tumors, and they were described in terms of where in the brain they were, right? Fast forward to the 1930s, and people started talking about different types of tumors, like a glioblastoma form, in terms of not where it was in the brain, but its microscopic anatomy, what kind of cells involved in the tumor. But now when we talk about brain tumors, we don't talk about just what types of cells are involved, but we really, for example, we now know that GBM is really biologically 3 different types of tumors, right, that are described by different patterns of gene expression, different genetic mutations, prognosis, response to different treatments. So one way to think about this is that, the ontology of cancer is no longer written in terms of an ontology of either anatomy or, cellular anatomy. It's written in the language of molecular biology. And if you look at cognitive science is increasingly written in the language of computation, right? So we don't describe, how people solve problems in terms of just, a linguistic kind of word-based description, but often we have computational theories, and that's been particularly clear in things like both, sort of drift diffusion models or things like reinforcement learning models, where people started bringing to bear on cognitive neuroscience. But nonetheless, most of the things that when we end up telling stories about how brains work in cognitive neuroscience, we're often telling stories that fundamentally go back to natural language descriptions, often describing things that are really kind of folk psychological concepts. Now, one way that's been proposed to help us kind of move on that and sort of really start mapping computational descriptions onto neural activity is, this work that's come out of a number of different labs. This is kind of well-known work from Dan Yeamans and Jim DiCarlo, where what they've done is basically built computational models of tasks, right? So for example, the task they're interested in is object identification. So they build models that are simply task-driven. The models don't know anything about the brain. Then they have animals, in this case, non-human primates, perform the same task, and then ask basically where in the model, in the computational model, are the most predictive of activity in the primate brain. And a similar work has been done, really nice work's been done by Kell et al. In Neuron a couple years ago, using a similar sort of approach in the auditory domain with fMRI. And what they basically show is, well, you get these isomorphisms between the increasingly complex structure of representations in a convolutional neural network and the increasingly complex structure of those representations in the primate brain, right? And so the idea is, can we start to learn something about what brain systems are doing from what we see these networks doing. And on the one hand, it seems like a really promising approach. On the other hand, I think it raises really difficult questions about what understanding means. So, Chris Olah has some really nice work on this particular website trying to understand the representations that hierarchical convolutional neural net builds when it comes to identify objects. So this shows that basically, early on, the individual units are representing much more primitive features, like the layer 3A on the left. Whereas on the, you get out to layer 5A and you start to see that, that the individual units are representing much more complex features and, for example, representing them in a rotationally invariant way, right? So this, it's seeing the dog with its face turned to the right, but actually the representation is something dog-ish looking. At least it looks like kind of like a dog to us, with its face turned to the left. So the question is, what do we get out of this type of analysis, right? Have we really learned anything more than the fact that we can predict, how the thing's going to respond to a particular image? And is the kind of description that we get out of this satisfying? And I think one of the challenges is that, we always want to come back to describing these things in terms of folk psychological sorts of concepts. And I think that, part of the neuroscientists and psychologists, psychology is deeply persistent. I think this is really clear from, this recent really amazing work by Jim DiCarlo's group on what they call deep image synthesis, right? Where the idea is you do this sort of closed loop modeling, find images that can cause a particular neuron to fire much more strongly than any natural scene of the many different natural scenes that they try, right? And so these things over on the right of the screen are the images that, I forget what area, I think this is V4, these are the kind of the things that cause particular neurons to fire most strongly. But when you look at those particular stimuli, you can kind of say, well, they look like, you can kind of tell a story about what they might look like, but it's not clear that that story is really getting you anything more than just, than knowing that you can predict the activity of those stimuli. It doesn't give us any sort of lower dimensional understanding. And so I think a really challenging question is, as we move into thinking about computational ontologies rather than cognitive kind of linguistic natural language ontologies, what is the kind of dimensional understanding going to look like? Or do we need to just give up on low dimensional understanding and only focus on being able to predict data? And for me as a scientist, that would seem unsatisfying. But I think that it's a challenge to know what else, how else could we deal with the problem? So just in conclusion, we've argued that to make progress in cognitive neuroscience, we need to move away from decoding tasks towards decoding the underlying cognitive functions. This requires an ontology. I think that this inverted cognitive encoding models provides a promising way to think about this. But ultimately, what we really want is a computational ontology rather than a cognitive, than a kind of a folk psychological ontology. And that's going to bring its own challenges in, its sort of understandability. Finally, I just want to thank all the various people who've collaborated with us on this. People in my lab. John Walters is the person who did the cognitive encoding model work. And plug my book if you haven't seen it, which goes into some of these sorts of questions about what neuroimaging can and can't tell us. So thanks very much, and I will now take some questions.
Javier said, Russ, before anything else, thank you very, very much for giving us this talk. We didn't quite figure out what to do regarding applause, but we thought about canning it, but it was a bit hokey. So I think that pretty much everyone will be very grateful for this, knowing what you talked about and what people are keen on. So as Javier said, let's try to, so if you want to ask a question, please go to the little icon with a small person and 3 lines at the bottom of your screen. It should be blue. And then you can go to the participant tab on your right-hand side and click on the little icon near your name that looks like a hand. And once I see it, I will call you and mute you so that you can ask the question. we're all very shy, but Ryan Goodwin has something here. Ryan, I've just unmuted you. WebEx should let me unmute you, but it's not doing it.
Sorry, can you hear me?
Yep.
Yes, perfectly.
That was just an applause. I didn't actually have a question. It was a great talk. Thank you.
Okay. Okay. It looks very much like the other hand icon. Okay. Dan Worker question. Dan, you're unmuted.
I can be heard now?
Yep.
Yeah.
So for the predicting, from a general task database predicting the results from other tasks, how much of that is purely, if you just, I don't think you quite cover just the primary sensory inputs. How much is modeled sort of just by like the very low level stuff, and how much is added on when you start adding on more nuance of the more advanced tasks?
I don't think I have handy the I think one way to get at that, look at the, like when we do the principal component regression, right? Because the first principal component of the design matrix is primarily, I think kind of visual stuff. And you get certainly much lower classification there, but it's still, kind of, if I remember correctly, in like 50% range, or maybe a little bit below that, but well above chance. But it keeps growing over those first 20 components. So it's not just the visual stuff. We also, we can look at like, which different components are kind of best kind of most associated with accurate prediction. And if I remember correctly, again, I don't have a slide on that, but it was the kind of motor response stuff was actually probably more, up there than the visual stuff, but the visual stuff was too. And so I think you're right that it's there, a lot of it is being captured by the kind of fairly low dimensional stuff around, is there a visual stimulus? Is there a, what kind of motor response is it? That sort of stuff. And we still have more work to do to dig into, what's being carried by these more sort of cognitive, deeper cognitive concepts.
Are there other people with questions? Come on, don't be shy. Just press the little icon and I will see you.
Can you hear me?
Yes,
Yeah, can you hear me?
Yeah.
I was wondering, Russ, if you could elaborate at the last part, you make this argument that, to understand brain function, we might need to get a way of using natural language descriptions. But you get to that point in which you started to show some examples that the results look like something that is really hard to interpret. So there might be that last step of bringing it back to language or to something we can think of to keep moving forward. So I was wondering what thoughts you have on that last step.
Yeah, I think that part of the problem is that the types of models that are being looked at here, these deep hierarchical convolutional neural networks, they're not constrained to give you any interpretability, right? But there's a lot of work in the kind of interpretable machine learning world about sort of providing models that both perform a task but also admit to some kind of interpretability. And so, I'm not sure if that's going to solve this problem for us, but I think that's at least one kind of, hopeful direction that, we might imagine that, you may not have to give up on any performance, or you might want to just give up on a little bit of performance of the, of the network in terms of doing the task. But if it can provide you with, more interpretability, then the question is, how do you define interpretability in terms of a loss function, right? And I think that's what people in that part of the world are working on. But I think it's part of it is just like a fundamental challenge for us as neuroscientists to ask, like, to what degree do we require being able to explain what these things that we see the brain doing in terms of kind of human understandable psychological functions, right? Because clearly there are other parts of science that that have given up on explaining things in terms of kind of human understandable concepts, right? take quantum mechanics. So, I think that's a challenge for us, just figuring out like what do we want from theories. I actually have a student right now who's working with myself and a couple of philosophers to start asking these kinds of questions about like, what do we want out of theories in neuroscience, given the complexity of the thing that we're working with, and given that, mental functions have this kind of, deeply, like it's very hard for us to think about mental functions without being influenced by our kind of subjective experience of those functions, right? That we're sort of fundamentally tied to folk psychology in a way that I think other fields, people aren't tied to folk biology in the same way that we're tied to folk psychology.
Thank you.
Okay. Let me just find another person. Dave?
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes, perfect.
Oh, great. So I was hoping to reflect back on your original question of what a brain region does in light of this approach. Does your work suggest an efficient way to sample task space to figure out what a certain region or network does in a single individual? Or could you use, real-time fMRI to like walk through the ontologies you've discussed and efficiently figure out which concepts excite a certain region or network or voxel?
Yeah, I think that the latter is a really cool idea. In fact, Romy Lorenz, who is currently in Germany but is coming to start a postdoc in my lab later this year, she's been doing work of exactly this type using real-time fMRI to try to sort of understand more limited version of these questions. But I think that there's some really interesting stuff to be done there. I think that the other thing that so I don't know that the real challenge is kind of figuring out the task space, right? How do you build tasks that can really span? The ultimate goal would be have a way to generate a task that spans any part of the cognitive space that you're interested in, right? Because one of the ways to think about the challenge here is basically, decorrelating different aspects of that design matrix, right? So we'd like to basically increase the rank of that design matrix. And that requires that we basically, be able to insert more functions that can help us decorrelate other functions. And I think that, there's certainly interesting ideas from like optimal experimental design that might help do that. I think the hard part is really, kind of going from the ontology into the task and knowing, because, often it's the judgment of a psychologist that says, oh, hey, I think that task measures this particular construct. You could also imagine if you had a computational ontology, you could actually have the model. If you had a computational model that implemented the ontology, you could have the model doing the tasks and then the model proposing new tasks for the person to do almost in a closed loop way like that. But I think we're pretty far.
I see Hendrik also has a question. Hendrik, do you want to ask? Hendrik is mic-less, I think. I haven't muted you. Should be okay. Have a technical problem. Okay.
If anyone wants to type a question, that's fine too.
Let me see. Right, he sent me the question via chat. I'm going to just ask on his behalf.
Okay.
Given several models that are all very limited in their ability to explain the variance in brain imaging experiments, how relevant is the question of which model is slightly better or worse?
I think that's a good question. And it's going to really depend on, it might be the case that, if there were really deep theoretical questions, the ability of one model to slightly better account for the data than others could actually be from the standpoint of theory testing, could actually be a really useful thing, right? That there are probably cases in other sciences where, large make the same prediction, but in one tiny little place, they make a different prediction, but it could matter a lot for understanding the underlying structure. I don't know offhand of what one of those cases might be, but I think it's going to. I think that the concern is a good concern to keep in mind, that we're just kind of arguing about very tiny little differences, and that don't really matter. But sometimes I think they could matter, and so I think it's my answer is, as my answer almost always is, it depends.
Okay. Does anyone else have a question? All right, then I get to ask a question. So Dave Jangro already asked what I was curious about, but I wanted to extend a little bit on that, in the sense of you showed results about generalizing across subjects. And what I was wondering is, did you do any experiments where you artificially lowered the number of tasks that you had access to when training the model that would generalize? And how much does that affect generalization performance? I.e., what would be the minimum set of tasks that would still work, that could be used perhaps as a standardized battery of things that you'd scan every subject on if you wanted to then?
The short answer is no, and I'll put that on our list of things. I mean, in some sense, the principal component stuff kind of gets at that in the sense that for any particular principal component, some of them are going to be sparser than others, and so it may well be the case that we can kind of infer which of the tasks do you need, but I don't think that's going to get us all the way there. So I think we need to add this to our list of things. That's a great suggestion. Thanks.
And since nobody else seems to have a question, I will ask another one. I was interested in the question of what is understandable and the granularity you can do this at, because intrinsically here you are essentially saying what you care about, and I hope I'm not doing an injustice here, is whether a particular chunk of cortex is involved in a particular task in some way. We're not saying if it's critical, if it's going to be what computation it's implementing, just that it is involved. And at the same time, there's a lot of research, and you alluded to that, where people are actually trying to build encoding models that are incredibly complex, that try to actually discover what the computation is being what is the computation that's being applied to a stimulus, and what are the successive representations that are being built in order to lead to a task performance. So how do you see these two types of approaches coming together?
I think the problem is that if we had models for high-level cognitive functions that were as detailed as the models that we have for low-level sensory functions like in the visual system, then we could do exactly the same thing here, right? And so we don't have good models of that form that can accomplish all of these different tasks. And so I think that's, for me, fundamentally, I would love to be able to do exactly the same thing, right? And it's just really a question of where do we find the model? So our kind of annotation of the tasks in terms of cognitive processes is kind of our first pass at trying to say what are the functions that are being done. But you're exactly right that ultimately you'd like to have a much more detailed model of those particular functions. And we could also imagine, even with the kind of word level stuff, being more detailed about the annotation, because our annotation is fairly coarse, even though it's finer grained than what we had, than like in the stuff with Gael, it's still pretty coarse. Right. But ultimately, I think we really want to do it using models, and we just don't have the models that we need to do it.
My final question along those lines is, you mentioned that paper by Alan Newell, and Alan Newell's answer to that question was to say, well, we need to build a model that can do many different tasks. And he has a proposition as to what that should be, and that became SOAR. So what do you think comes closest to being something that would fulfill Newell's vision? It's a completely speculative question, and just out of curiosity.
I mean, the things that I know, this is not a field that I follow deeply, but the things that I know about that I think come closest now are, one, the work that's been done in the ACT, or whatever ACT you want to call it, stuff from John Anderson and his progeny. And so like Andrea Stocco has been doing, nice work, I think, trying to take those sorts of models and relating them to brain activity, as has John. They've been mostly focused on kind of, very high level cognitive sorts of stuff. And I think that's, like problem solving and those sort of things. And I think it's really interesting. I don't know those models well enough to know kind of, how easily they can take on lots of different tasks. Another approach that I think is, potentially promising, and again, I haven't had the time to really dig into it, but Chris Elias-Smith has been doing work building, these models that really try to engage in a really broad set of task behaviors, kind of end-to-end kind of behavioral models. And I think that kind of approach also may be someplace that we can look. And then, but finally, there's some work on a kind of more limited scale from this guy, I think his name is Peter Yang, working with Xiaoxing Wang and others, to try to basically build, it's still a pretty limited task domain, but trying to train neural networks to perform kind of sets of tasks, and then looking at the representations that arise out of that. So that's another different way of thinking about it. But again, it's a much more limited scale of tasks. So I think there's a lot of potential ways to do it. None of them, I think, can really kind of do all that, we need something that could do all the tasks in that multitask database, and that's a lot of different tasks.
Great, thank you very much. That answers all the questions that I had. We're getting to 3 p.m., so unless there are more people raising their hands, we'll close this.
All right, well, thanks very much.
Thank you very, very much for giving us the talk, Russ. This was great. I think, and I have other people sending me messages saying that they are very grateful. So.
All right. Well, thanks for the invite.
Thank you. Have a good day.
All right. Bye-bye.